Guys, thank you so much for being here today with us. Today we have a very special guest. He is Professor Bryan Meadows. He is a friend of mine. He is a person I appreciate a lot. Bryan is a very intelligent person. He is from the United States, but now he is in South Korea working and teaching and also studying in this country, no, Bryan? Bryan, so once again, thank you so much for being here with us today. We appreciate your experience, your expertise in the field, and all the comments and all the issues you have to share with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor John, for the kind and welcome introduction. I am so happy to be here and to have this chance to connect with everyone. John is a well-respected colleague and dear friend of mine, so I'm grateful for this chance to reconnect and to also connect with you. And hopefully our conversation today, my goal is to spark an interest in your own research trajectory. And I look forward to hearing your ideas and our conversation about the topics that I present to you today. So thank you again for this really wonderful opportunity. It is really an honor and a privilege to be here to speak with you. May I share my screen?
Yes,
Yes?
perfect.
Okay. Okay, let's see if I can do this correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see traditional old style
Yes.
PowerPoint? Yes. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So I have some um, I have some discussion planned for us together today. I believe my goal is around 40 minutes together. However, please feel free to stop me along the way. And Professor John, definitely, if I'm going over time, please jump in and let me know. Um, sometimes I get lost in the conversation, so I apologize in advance. Yeah, my topic is nationalism and second language education. This has been my research trajectory for, let me see, at least 15 years now. It's been very rewarding. It's a topic that I found very interesting. And I'm very pleased to know that the group is looking at English as a lingua franca, because I think you can find some connections between nationalism and English as a lingua franca. In particular, probably you'll recognize the dangers that nationalism presents for English lingua franca, the way that nationalism can take away from the ideals of English lingua franca. A quick introduction about myself. I was in New Jersey, United States, for at least 13 years, but my home state is Texas, down in the South. I have about 25 years of experience in language education, about 14 years in higher education, working as a faculty member. I've been fortunate enough to do peer-reviewed publications, also to publish, I present at conferences, both locally and also internationally. I have had a really rewarding experience working with the Asokopi organization. So if you're not a part of Asokopi, I really encourage you to get involved. They're a really wonderful group doing important research, and I always come away very inspired by my work together with them. I believe the next conference is coming up in October, and unfortunately I won't be there in person this year, but I hope to attend in coming years. And as Professor John mentioned, I'm currently residing in Seoul, South Korea. It is really interesting because I'm very new to the Korean language, Korean culture, Korean society, so I'm learning a lot every day, and it is interesting as an applied linguist to become a novice again in a new language and to experience that all over again. So I'm remembering a lot of things about our field as a beginner language learner again. And my hope is to finally complete my book. We'll see. So here's my overview of my talk this evening. My plan is to introduce to you a research agenda that's at the intersection of nationalism and language education. This has been my research agenda for a good 15 years now, so I'm very excited to share that with you and to receive your perspectives. I'm going to discuss the relevance of this intersection. I'll talk about the composition, kind of the theoretical background of this agenda. I'll talk about some research methods because I understand this group is uh, conducting research, but then also thinking ahead to your own research agenda in the future. So hopefully this will give you some additional ideas. I'd like to share some existing scholarship at this intersection, and then where I believe we're headed with this research agenda. I'm looking forward to a Q&A session, to hearing your thoughts, especially how this topic relates to English as a lingua franca. That'd be really, really interesting. And also I have a thought exercise for you. I'm going to invite you to into one of my research projects and see what you think. All right, so let's start. The research agenda is at the intersection of nationalism and language education. So my goal is to share with you this research agenda that I've been pursuing all of these years. We always start a research agenda with a definition of terms. So when I'm talking about nationalism, I'm talking about an ideology of social organization that is pervasive in modern societies to the point that usually we don't even really recognize that we're participating in this ideology. Ideology you can understand as kind of a mindset, a framework for understanding the world around you. Nationalism, when you really think about it, is all about social organization. How do you create categories? Who belongs in this category? Who belongs in that category? Um, and these are framed as nations. And this ideology has been very successful in our modern world. Um, Michael Billig called it banal nationalism. It's the idea that we don't even really recognize that we're living in these nationalized worlds. And I don't know about you, but this was very interesting to me when I was in graduate school. I was introduced to nationalism studies, and the professor pointed out that these nation states that we're living in today in the modern society have not always been here. They are not naturally formed, that they came about, at least in Western Europe, they came about in the 1700s, 1800s. The idea that you have a political state that represents a nation, the nation state. These organizations are relatively new. Prior to that, political states were organized along different lines. They were organized according to religion, for example, the monarchy, it could be an empire. But the idea of a nation state, the idea of a political state that reflects one national people, this is something relatively new in our human history, which I found fascinating. So this is nationalism. This is the definition I'm working with. Language education, on the other hand, I think everyone can provide an excellent definition of language education. I'm thinking about formal instruction when you have a classroom where you have a teacher and you have a student, you have a set routine when you meet every week or every day. And the instruction is in a language or language of variety that is new to the students. So this can be English as an international language. It could be English as a second language, English as a foreign language, English as a lingua franca, English as a global language, however you would like to phrase it, depending on the context. However, my idea of language education is not restricted to English, but this is just a reflection of my own limitations, of my professional training and my personal background. I tend to talk about English language classrooms, but my definition is much broader. Okay. Why, as a language teacher, should I care about nationalism? Why is this relevant to the field of applied linguistics, to the field of language education? Um, yeah, so the following reasons. So here is the argument for the relevance. When we think about it, the decisions that we make as language educators surrounding nationalized things. So when we talk about national cultures, national languages, national authenticity, national representation, all of these decisions that we make are intertwined with ongoing practices of social marginalization beyond the classroom walls. So in other words, the decisions that we make about who counts in our classroom, who does not count in our classroom, who is the ideal model, who is not the ideal model, All of these questions are intertwined or connected with these larger issues of social marginalization outside the classroom. So the decisions that we make can perpetuate, but they can also challenge the social hierarchies that we define by nationalism. So there are many different kinds of social hierarchies along different dimensions, but my interest is really in nationalism. So if you define, so for example, who are the true national people? So who represents the nation? Those people are going to be afforded certain privileges, and those who are not considered true national people, the authentic people, they're going to be marginalized and not afforded the same privileges that the other group will have. Think about language. Who speaks the correct national standard language and who does not? And what are the privileges and disadvantages that come with those categories? And whose worldview is going to represent us globally? So if we're going to represent our nation to other people, which people or which lifestyles, which subjectivities do we choose to represent to the rest of the world? So who counts and who does not count? So all of these questions are also questions that we engage with in the field of language education, and the decisions that we make have consequences for ongoing social hierarchies. So to make the point even finer, think about these kinds of questions that we have to answer all the time as language educators. Whose language practices are legitimate enough to teach? When you take a language class, what kind of varieties are you studying and who decided this? Why is this language variety more legitimate than another one? When you think about culture in the classroom, intercultural education, cultural competence, those kinds of things, whose cultural practices become legitimate enough to teach, to become part of the curriculum? What is the end point of your language classroom? When you do assessment, what kind of speaker, what kind of social actor are you imagining for the assessment? How do we define ourselves in this classroom setting? This is important. Who is a legitimate instructor? So who gets the job to receive payment to work in the language classroom? And how do we decide these qualifications? What is the model that we're imagining on the search committees when we're selecting people to act as instructors? And what kind of instructor do students want? Students also have their own preconceptions about legitimate language instructors. Right? And then finally, what is the purpose of our language study? Why are we doing this? So that is to say that nothing about language education is predetermined. Nothing is a given. These are all choices that we make, either consciously or subconsciously, that we make as teachers, that our students are making, that administrators are making, and all of these decisions have material and symbolic consequences for our students, both locally, but then also the larger communities outside our classroom. So that is the relevance argument for this topic. Oh, sorry. Yep. Okay. So this is something that I encourage everyone to think about, especially now at the beginning of kind of the cusp, kind of the beginnings of your career in language education. I'd like you to begin now asking yourself this question on a regular basis. What ideologies am I relying on when making decisions around what to teach, how to teach? Why am I choosing this language or cultural model? And why am I discounting or discarding this other model? I think it's valuable practice as educators, as professionals, to always ask these questions on a regular basis to reflect on the ideologies and the belief systems that we bring into our teaching situation. So the goal of this agenda, of course, is not to wish nationalism away. Nation states are established institutions. I think national categories are useful for us for many reasons. And certainly the goal here is not to say nations do not exist, nationalism does not exist, it's all a big charade. It's not to say that, but what I'd like to do is to raise our awareness as educators of how the ideology works to marginalize and then to privilege others. And I believe that once we understand in a sophisticated way how this ideology works, we are now empowered. We now have larger agency as language teachers. That allows us to then consider additional possibilities in the classroom for teaching. We can expand the possibilities. We can work beyond these nationalized conventional boundaries of what is correct and what is not correct. We can work beyond that and really engage students with global diversity. But at the same time, there is also a possibility for us to minimize the harm that's inflicted on communities in the name of nationalism. So these ideas of national authenticity, these ideas of national legitimacy, it's not predetermined. It's always changing, always evolving. So we can advocate for a new kind of discourse that is more inclusive and minimizes the harm that we do on a regular basis to communities based on these stereotypes, I guess, or these ideas of national categories. We can be part of the solution, right? So why should we, those are the reasons why we should think about nationalism as language teachers. Now, what I'd like to do next is to provide a little bit of background into these two theoretical camps that I have been using for this agenda. These are not the only, I guess, theoretical strands that are relevant, but these are the two that I have closely embraced over the years, and I'm happy to share what I know about them today. Nationalism theory. I was introduced to nationalism theory in graduate school. It was just one class with one professor, and he really opened my eyes to nationalism as an ideology. I always assumed that nationalism is just the way the world is, but he helped me to understand that it's actually an ideology. It's a way of thinking about the world, and it's not the only way of thinking about the world. And that has opened my eyes to a lot of really interesting research all these years. So it's interesting. It can be just one class, just one assignment. It could be one reading that sparks a lifelong interest in something. Okay, so a few things that we know about nationalism from nationalism studies. These are the key scholars that I use for this area, such as Anderson, Billig, Gellner, Hearn, Kedry, and Cohn. One is that nations are social constructions that individuals call upon in everyday discourse to take social action. So nationalism is an ideology like other ideologies that we call upon in interactions with one another for various functions. So it could be to bring solidarity between people. It could be to create distance. It could be to influence collective action. We most clearly see this in the action of politicians. That's the most overt um, function, most overt illustration of this function here of influencing collective action, but it's not the only one. Number two, nationalism as an ideology prefers rigid boundaries between nationalized categories. So the ideology of nationalism provides us arguments and provides us a logic to exaggerate and emphasize distinction between nationalized groups. So this country, everything about this country is distinct from this other country. So nationalism is not that nationalism itself is acting, but we tap into these arguments, we tap into these logics in order to exaggerate and then to carry out our social functions, but also provides us the reasoning to exaggerate differences between categories. At the same time, nationalism prefers homogeneity within nationalized categories. So distinction between nations, but also within the nation, nationalism provides us a logic to emphasize and to prefer homogeneity, some kind of standardization, so that we can say, we as a national people, this is preferred within nationalism. It gives us a reason to emphasize this. Nationalism links a political state with a nationalized people. This is the key, I guess, innovation of nationalism in Western Europe in the 1700s, is linking a political state with an established national people. And the state reflects the essence of the national people. That created the idea of the nation state. It's an ideology, so we maintain this in discourse like other ideologies. And finally, nationalism has become a pervasive, not perversive, pervasive frame pervasive frame for how we interpret society around us. So I don't know about you, but I tend to look at communities around me very often through a nationalist frame, that these are the national people here, nationalist people here, national people here. It's very useful for us, and it's very convenient. And that's one of the reasons why it's so pervasive, that it really does shape a lot of our perceptions today in human societies. Right. So for language education, social practice theory is something that I like to um, that I rely on for this particular research agenda. There are many different ways of theorizing language education. Social practice theory is the one that seems to make the most sense for me and for what I like to do in my research agenda. So very briefly, social practice theory, I'm looking back at Bourdieu, Ortner, Hanks, Van Leeuwen, and then in particular for second language education is Richard Young and Astarita. So some of the I guess, established understandings based on social practice theory are the following. One is that social practices are actions that people take in coordination with others to convey symbolic meanings which carry social consequences. So social practices, it's a very broad term, but it could be your profession. So we as language teachers, that would be our social practice, is doing language teaching. So the way that we do language teaching has symbolic meanings, and then there are consequences for the way that we do our practices in small communities. Linguistic practices, that is discourse, is a regular means by which we act upon social ideologies such as nationalism. So linguistic practices is one form of social practice. And then people enact social practices within social landscapes of unequal power relations. So this is critical theory. This is the idea that we operate in social landscapes where there is unequitable access to the resources available in the social field. Yep, so that leads us to power. So power, you can theorize in different ways, but for social practice theory, a lot of scholars talk about symbolic resources, and the metaphor a lot of scholars like to use is capital. So symbolic capital, linguistic capital, social capital. These are the symbolic resources that people can tap into and utilize in different kinds of social fields. And this goes back to Bourdieu's original discussion of social practice theory. However, these symbolic resources are situated in context dependent. They are subject to change, they're always evolving. What can be maybe a source of privilege now could be a source of marginalization later. The value of a particular resource all depends on the situation. Who is talking to whom? Where are you talking? When is this taking place? Et cetera, et cetera. So it all depends on the context. This is all context dependent, which means that we can also act upon these resources and we can change these resources over time with intention. Okay, so we've talked about the relevance, we've talked about some of the theoretical background to this research agenda. What are the research methods that are appropriate to this research agenda? What have I been utilizing over these years to investigate this agenda? I believe many of us here in this meeting probably use a lot of qualitative approaches. I also understand that you have some experience working with critical approaches. So when I'm working with text, I often approach it through a critical lens, so critical discourse analysis. These are the larger frames, the orientations. And then within those orientations, there are particular techniques that I've been using. Wow, that got really small. Ethnographic methods of participant and observation. I think we're familiar with these. This allows you to get into actual settings of classrooms and understanding how people use nationalism, how they tap into it, how they utilize it in the classroom for different purposes. Interviews are also useful research methods for this research agenda. With interviews, they can be structured or they can be open. With interviews, you're able to get some insights into how people, I guess, represent themselves and how people make sense of nationalized categories in their language setting. So I've used interviews. Surveys are very useful for understanding semantics, to understand distinctions that people make between words and how they categorize individuals and different linguistic practices. So surveys are useful to get a general feel for how people are interpreting different words and categories. Text analysis is essential. So text analysis, this is looking at transcripts, looking at ethnographic observations, also interviews, you need text analysis. Even surveys require some text analysis. So text analysis is essential to this line of research. And then finally, I'm sorry, it's very small, but the word is very basic frequency statistics. So I have been using frequency statistics, excuse me, such as averages and means and medians. And this is often used with surveys. We'll check out the averages of what people have responded back with in the surveys. I haven't used very much statistics with ethnographic methods, interviews, some statistics with text analysis, and then sometimes I use statistics with broader descriptions of the setting of the language classroom. We can use statistics for that outside. Okay, so those are the research methods. One thing that I wanted to share with you is everyday nationalism. This is within nationalism studies. This is an orientation that really fits well with social practice theory, and it also works well for the classroom setting. So I have been utilizing everyday nationalism. This is one kind of subfield within nationalism studies. So I at least wanted to share that with you today. Everyday nationalism is an established approach. It fits well with what we're trying to do with this research agenda. Everyday nationalism looks at the ways in which individuals realize nationalized things. So if you can imagine, the ideology is there, and then people nationalize different things within their classroom setting for different purposes. So it's very common in a classroom to hear people talk about a nationalized food, or maybe a national music. So we can think about music exists as a social practice already, but when we attach a category to it and say, this is our national music, this is our national folk music, what people are doing is they're nationalizing it in the classroom setting for various purposes. So everyday nationalism is looking at those very specific discursive processes. How do people nationalize things, and to what ends? Why are they doing that in the classroom setting? Everyday nationalism is very interested in individual agency. Some forms of nationalism studies, they're looking at the bigger picture. They're looking at the movements of the political state. They're looking at the movements of national policy that are set by the institution. But everyday nationalism is looking down at the ground roots, at the ground up, looking at how do individuals in everyday situations, how do they enact nationalism in their everyday lives? And I think the big idea here, again, just to emphasize it, is that anything can be nationalized. For example, during my dissertation research, I lived at the border between the United States and Mexico, and I was traveling back and forth every day to conduct my research. And one time I came from the United States. No, what happened? Yeah, I was in the United States, and then I went into Mexico. I collected my data, and then I stopped by the store and I purchased some fruit. And then I was bringing the fruit back into the United States. And I remember I stopped at the border, and the United States officer was asking me what I have in my car. And I explained I have fruit with me that I purchased at the store on the other side in Mexico. And it's very interesting. He said, that is now Mexican fruit. You can no longer bring that into the United States. And I thought it was so weird because in my mind it was just fruit, but now in this context it has been nationalized. This is now Mexican fruit, which is distinct from the United States fruit. So I think that was a great illustration, realization for me that really anything can be nationalized. So Everyday Nationalism, this is their mission statement. I'm going to skip ahead. I think what's relevant for us is the idea that everyday nationalism gives us the tools to reveal how this ideology works to make nationalized world. So this is a call presented by Us Kurimli. He says, for example, that nationalism requires us to focus on the processes through which nationhood becomes a significant site of identification. Our call is to explore how the national comes to be socially established as reality. So, how do we construct nationalized things in our everyday lives? This is what scholars of nationalism are working on. But I propose that this task is also worthy of our efforts as language educators. I think as language educators, we are immersed in nationalism. It defines what languages we teach, it defines culture, it defines where and how we teach, because many of us teach in national public institutions. So we are immersed in nationalism. How so we can provide important input into the ongoing conversation. So we have a unique um, context in which we engage with nationalism, and our experiences can be of value to nationalism studies writ large. Right, so some of the existing scholarship that influences me all of these years, I started my journey in 2009 in that graduate class with that professor at the University of Arizona. I'm sure there are scholars who inspire you as well. And I encourage you to seek them out and to always uh, appreciate them and really take value from what they have provided to all of us. These are the scholars who have inspired me all of these years. Briefly, Risager, she talked about the transnational paradigm. She first um, put the idea in my head. She first put the idea in my head. Am I still sharing my PowerPoint or did I mess it up? Are you still seeing my PowerPoint? Yeah. Okay. All
Yeah,
right. So,
yeah.
okay, thank you. Sorry, I pressed some buttons here and I thought I messed it up. Okay, so she first put the idea in my head that we don't have to teach language classes according to national categories. She called it the transnational paradigm. More recently, she's been doing important work with representation in textbooks. How do we represent nationalized cultures, and what are the advantages and disadvantages to what we're doing? Gulliver has done some important work with banal nationalism in ESL textbooks. How do our textbooks reflect um, kind of a taken for granted status for nationalism? Golden has done some really important work. It's been some time now, but she's done some important work with national identity and student resistance in the adult language education context. Very interesting study. She was looking at recent migrant adults to Israel who were taking Hebrew language classes and how there was a particular form of Israeli identity that was promoted by the teacher and the students resisting this standardized identity. It was so interesting to read. So I was inspired by this work. And more recently, Macintosh has helped us understand neo-nationalism. So this is a form of nationalism that is hyper-focused on physical borders. So there's a lot of hate that's expressed towards migrant communities and the importance of maintaining physical boundaries. So that's neo-nationalism. So Macintosh has helped us to understand how this is interacted with our field of applied linguistics. Ty has done some important work helping us to understand that we should approach culture through a very critical lens. These these very homogeneous or I guess standardized views of culture, we have to always challenge those. That if we look underneath the surface, there's a lot of diversity there. And Durbin has done really important work, a lot of important conceptual work, helping us to think beyond intercultural education to use the term interculturality. And he draws our focus to the diversity of diversities and how does that look in language education context. So Dervin has also done really inspiring work. So I'm grateful to all of them. This is my own string of published studies. I certainly don't want to present myself as um, kind of bragging about my work, but I wanted to just, I guess, share with you the string of studies that have evolved from this one graduate class. At one graduate class, it sparked my interest in nationalism and how that has led me on this journey over 15 years of exploring nationalism and language education from these different perspectives. So I think the purpose in sharing this is really to give you an idea of what's possible ahead of you as you launch into your own research agenda and all the different ways that you can explore your particular topic. I have had a lot of fun looking at this topic. I know my wife, of course, has heard me talk about nationalism for 15 years now, so she's heard all about it. But I'm really excited by this topic. I find it so fascinating, and there's so many different things that we can learn about nationalism and how we use it in our language teaching. So I what I'd like to do is share this PowerPoint with you. So maybe Professor John is able to share the PowerPoint with you. All of these links are live throughout the PowerPoint, so you can find links and find these articles and these resources online if you'd like to get more information about them. Also contact me if you have difficulty accessing any of these studies and any of the studies throughout this PowerPoint. There are a lot of hyperlinks embedded for you. I'm looking at my time too, Professor John. I think I have like 5 minutes left or so. So very quickly, what have I done? I have looked at how people craft representations according to an audience. I've looked at how students can find value in clear borders between the United States and Mexico in this case, but I'm assuming it applies in other settings. I've looked at how nationalism takes away from intercultural competence. So if you've studied intercultural competence, I've presented some arguments why nationalism can detract from that ideal. I've written with a colleague, Dr. Cole, thinking about communities of practice as an alternative to national cultures. So if you're in a language classroom, you may not be teaching cultures, but you may be teaching communities of practice. So we talked about how that's possible. Nationalism as a grounds of language complaints, code mixing. So I imagine you're familiar with complaints against code mixing. We should not mix maybe Spanish and English, for example. You should speak Spanish or you should speak English, but you should not mix those two. If you really look at what people are saying and examine their arguments in more detail, you'll see that sometimes nationalism is the grounds for their complaint. And of course, this is not a linguistic argument at all. I've also attempted to illustrate the systematics of national claims. So when we're in language classrooms, we're making claims about national places. So in Cuba, we do this. In China, we do this. In Australia, we do this. So how do those claims become legitimate? How are they legitimized? How do they stick? I've looked at the role of nationalism in anti-bilingual education campaigns. So in this case, the United States, I was looking at public discourse advocating for a monolingual education policy and why a bilingual policy is dangerous. Again, these are arguments based on nationalism. So my goal was to deconstruct those arguments to clarify what the grounds are. And I've attempted to create a model of how nationalism circulates through the narratives of culture at micro, meso, and macro levels. So how do we function as one site of circulation of the ideology of nationalism? How do we function in that larger process in the classroom? And then finally, I did interviews with teachers in different parts of the world. And it was so interesting to learn what they were doing to resist nationalized generalizations. So they were sharing with me really interesting techniques they use to downplay the way that students are predisposed to seek out and to affirm stereotypes and generalizations. Those are very familiar and they're very safe and they're reassuring, but these teachers are really excellent in the way that they help students to step away from generalizations and stereotypes and to see the world in more complex ways. Okay, so we're heading into the final pieces of my talk. I appreciate your attention. I'm looking forward to your perspectives and your views on this topic, and especially how it links to English as a lingua franca. But to close up, where are we headed with this agenda? Where do I think we're going? As I've stated at the beginning, the agenda, the real purpose here is to provide illustrations of how nationalism works. This can be useful to language educators and will put them in a position to maybe act upon structural change within their own classroom. How do you do teaching? Maybe this will change as you learn more about nationalism, and that might have a knock-on effect outside your classroom. How can we shape or resist or help to develop the discourse outside of the classroom about national categories? Who counts and who doesn't count? Yep. And the impact is to help language educators to see holes or defects in nationalist logic so that you, as a working professional, as a language professional, you come to question nationalized boundaries, and then you bring that into your own teaching and share that with your students. So really, I'd like to close with a call to action. As you become informed by how nationalism works on language classroom settings, I hope that you feel you're in a position to act with agency, to push back for greater inclusion and representation in what we do and how language education is understood in formal settings of education. All right, so thank you for allowing me this opportunity. It's been a true honor and privilege to share this with you. As I said, my wife has heard me talk about nationalism for nonstop for 15 years now, so I'm grateful to have this opportunity to share these ideas with you. Thank you, Professor John, for the invitation. Here's my contact information, and I'll leave this up and I'll open up the floor to Q&A discussion. Towards the end, I have my references, so if you'd like to jump ahead and look at the references, please do so. And I'll leave this up with my contact information. And I'll turn the floor back to Professor John. Thank you, Professor John.
No, Professor, thank you very much to you for having accepted this invitation. It was an honor to have you here today talking to us. So guys, if any of you has a question or like a comment or a concern, you can jump in and let us know what you think, so it's fine. Nicolas? Okay, Nicolas. We have the first one, Professor. So Nicolas, go ahead. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, teacher. Good night. Good afternoon. I think that there is morning. Morning, yes. Professor Bryan.
Yes, it's the morning. Yes.
Yeah, I had a concern about nationalism itself because I think it brings the like a positive and negative idea. Yeah, even though if it is like going that way, because sometimes we do consider things that make or builds our identity, that we nationalize those. I think that would be an example of how fights in Colombia are because of the arepa, if it is Venezuelan or Colombian. Yeah. So the question would be, do you consider that nationalism, is it a way of valuing our own culture, or is it just a barrier between cultures that might happen even within the same culture? Because sometimes it might happen that who is more national than the other. So that would be the question.
Yes, Nicholas, thank you for your question. Thank you for your interest in this topic. And yeah, I agree. I think nationalism, I mean, we have to admit sometimes there are some positive things about it, but there are also a lot of negative things that can take away from our students' growth, and also it can take away from the rights and the privileges that people are entitled to in our classroom and outside the classroom. So to your question, it was, as I understand it, please forgive me. The question is if there is diversity within a nationalized culture, is that the question? Forgive me.
Yes, teacher. if it is a way of valuing our own culture, as you said, something like you see communities as like nationals, and also if or is it just like a barrier that might happen and can like be in the middle so that the cultures cannot relate well.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, um, I think one way to look at it is that a national culture, a national culture is a social construction. So whatever is a national culture is something that we all agree upon, first of all. And I think in order to create this category, there are certain things that we have to include and then certain things that we discard. So very often when I'm talking about, let's say, the United States, I'm sorry, I have to talk about the context I know best, so I'm limited in that way. But if I'm talking about the United States, if I say to someone, the United States, North American culture, then I'm starting to limit who counts and who doesn't count in that particular category. Um, so So I think what we do in the classroom is when we talk about one individual culture or one individual United States or American culture, we are presenting it as if it's homogeneous or presenting it as if it's coherent enough to have just one thing together. And in doing that, we are ignoring, I guess, displacing or discounting a lot of diversity that's within it. Um, So I think we have to be clear in what we're doing when we talk about one individual culture in the classroom and how we are privileging some and marginalizing others. What some teachers have done is talk about cultures always in the plural. So instead of Tai was really great about this, Professor Tai. She encouraged us to not talk about a Japanese culture, but to talk about Japanese cultures always in the plural. And that allows students to always keep the plurality, to keep the diversity in their minds. So if you allow me to um, maybe make reference to Colombian culture, national identity, you could talk about a Colombian culture, or you could talk about Colombian cultures, and it creates two different frames in the minds of the students immediately. When you talk about Colombian cultures, immediately it piques their interest and draws their attention to the diversities that is there, and the diversity that nationalism as an ideology, it encourages us to overlook or to kind of polish over and to ignore. And I believe that's what we should avoid as language teachers. We should always try to bring the diversity back into our classrooms as much as possible for both pedagogical reasons, but also for ethical reasons. Nicholas, I'm not sure if I still answer your question.
Yes, you did.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I think I I I think one of the big things to think about is what exactly is a culture and who decides that this is a national culture. I mean, it's a social construction, so this is always changing. I mean, I'm sorry, Professor John, but this is something actually that my colleague and I, Professor Cole, we were suggesting was to stop using culture altogether in language classrooms and to talk about communities of practice. So the communities of practice idea comes out of social practice theory. And communities of practice is talking about smaller groups of communities who are mutually engaged with each other. They usually have kind of a shared practice, like they have a shared identity together. And then they often have a shared lexicon or a shared discourse or like particular words or terminology that they use that other groups may not know. So the example that they've used in social practice could be a profession. So think about language teachers. So we as language teachers could form communities of practice. There are communities of language teachers all engaged in a similar practice around the world. So we create kind of this, you could call it a culture, but we create like this network of communities of practice. We kind of understand ourselves as language teachers. We kind of share expectations in the classroom that there is one teacher, there may be classroom materials, there are students in the classroom, maybe there are assignments, there are tests, the class will begin and the class will end. We have all these assumptions that we bring to our practice. Also, there's terminology that is unique to us as a profession that people outside the profession may not exactly understand in the same way. And then finally, we're engaged with each other. We interact with each other. So this is a great example of how we communicate and interact with each other. So think about that idea of community of practice. Is it possible to have this idea of, let's say, I don't know, German culture? If we have German culture, could it be a whole network of communities of practice all practicing German? So there are many, many varieties and many, many ways that communities practice being German, and all of this collective together may create the culture, but can we look at communities of practice in the language classroom and look at really detailed communities? Is that possible, yes or no? So my colleague and I, Professor Cole, we're suggesting that yes, that instead of talking about these big cultures, let's look at individual communities as much as possible, so that we can always engage in the diversity and we can get beyond these grand generalizations that nationalism takes us to. Okay, I hope that was helpful. I'm sorry, maybe that was too much.
It's fine. Professor, I think we also have Daniel who wants to make a question or a comment maybe. So Daniel?
Yes, Daniel, please.
Yeah, more like both. But yeah, I'd say that first of all, I think that it's a great work, and mostly because it gets a big leap in representation between all we are trying to work in, like interculturality, and also the way that our language can take big leads in communication, but more of as a means of interculturality. And I think that one of the biggest examples of like nationalisms that a lot of people don't usually realize for our generation, it's uh, there was like a trend, or more as a tendency for some people to talk as Mexicans, even though that they are Colombians. So it was really curious, and I mean it was really fascinating because there were some people that it was like, yeah, but I would like to talk like this, yeah, but you are Colombian, so where is this culture about? Are you really Colombian, or are you really just getting all the culture that really interests you, or is it something intrinsic uh, inside of your own knowledge? Like, are you being subjective or objective with the perspective that you have with other cultures? And my question is, how have you experienced nationalism in Seoul?
Yes, Danielle, thank you for your question. Thank you for your interest in this topic. And I'm very pleased to hear the connections that you're making with interculturality. The example that you provided about people in Colombia appropriating, I guess, or taking on the linguistic practices that are understood as a different nation, and kind of the questions that this presents and kind of the conflict. I think that's a very interesting example. Your question was about Seoul, right? About encountering nationalism in Seoul. What can I say? So I've been here for about 8 weeks now, and we we are here attached to an international school, which is really in many ways it's run by people in the United States. So many of the people who are running the school, many of the people who are teaching in the school identify as American, as United States American, and they are identified as United States American. So it kind of creates this kind of bubble within the larger Seoul society. There's this little bubble of people enacting social practices that many of us recognize as American. So I think that alone is very interesting, is the way that people, even though they move to another physical location, they maintain the national practices that are familiar to them. I don't know yet, but probably there's a little bit of policing as well. So if someone tries to maybe act a little too native or maybe pick up Korean language or cultural practices, then people within this American bubble then may start questioning them. Is why are you acting this way? And you're American, and that doesn't look right. So I imagine that is going to come up at some point. I haven't encountered that yet. Let me see. I think I have identified some things. Yeah, I find it interesting in conversations with people here so far, is people pointing out, well, this is a Korean thing, or you don't understand because you're an American. And then even in my own thought process too, I recognize, oh, that's really different for me. Now I feel very American, United States American. So yeah, I'm experiencing that. I think my study of nationalism has kind of helped me to understand what's going on and to not take it as personally, and to also recognize that these categories are malleable, and it all depends on, you know, what we say and how we say and what we resist. So yeah, I'm learning about myself and learning about my own expectations now that I've left my nationalized context. But going back to your question about those in Colombia who are picking up linguistic practices that are identified as Mexican, yeah, this goes to the issues of ownership. And I think this is an important question for us as language teachers, is who owns the language practices that we're teaching? Who owns the cultural practices that we're teaching? As we know, in the field of English language teaching, for a long time, it's been dominated by white Western European coming from particular areas, the so-called native speakers in the United States, Canada, Australia, the UK. Thankfully, things are changing, and I think it's diversifying a little bit. I think English as a lingua franca is a really important area to push back against these social hierarchies. So I encourage you to continue thinking about ownership, and thinking about context. So who has the authority to use which kinds of practices and which kinds of situations? I think we as language teachers have to continue to think critically about ownership and what we legitimize and what we don't legitimize, what we challenge. Because I think English is a lingua franca, and I think we as language teachers, we have an important role to play in expanding the ownership, to expanding the participation and the agency of more people when it comes to language practice, to language use. Danielle, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, like
Is that good?
really.
Thank you for your question. Thank you for your interest in the topic.
Professor, thank you so much. We also have David here, so maybe he wants to make a comment or another question. So David, it's fine.
Yes.
Yeah,
I'm going to
thank you.
stop sharing.
I'm sorry, you were about
Yes.
to say something.
Yeah, yes, I'm sorry, David. I stopped sharing now, but I'm ready. David, please. I'm ready for your.
Okay.
Tell me, what would you like to
Okay,
talk about?
so again, thank you for being here, and thanks to Professor John as well for this space.
Yes.
Okay, actually, something that you're already proposing, and it's about like who counts and who doesn't count. Like how nationalism selects what is national on what is not, because for example, not all the people from the same country have like the same beliefs, the same cosmogony, and the same processes of identity construction. Actually, in our context, we have, like as you said, many cultures, it's really different, like the north from the south of the country. And it happens like in the US as well, because I think
Yes.
the perspectives and the processes of identity construction and reconfiguration are not the same for like a white man than for a black man, or even
Yes.
we are talking about gender for a black woman.
Yes.
So there are like different perspectives, but how they align in the same nationalism, like it's something that is really calling my attention, maybe in your context.
Great.
Yeah, I think that will be all because I was really curious that you said that this nationalism focuses on enhancing like strict categories within it. But at the same time, and as my classmates mentioned, uh, we are it's like promoting a social and cultural practice and practices of a group that is already having like economic and social power as well, because we are talking
Yes.
about, for example, a global north nationalism. So
Yes,
yeah,
that's true.
that is my question, like how nationalism selects what is national and what is not, uh, for example,
hmm
in your context of the USA.
Oh, yes. Thank you, David, for your interest in the topic, and also thank you for reflecting on the way that nationalism encourages us to, I guess, ignore or to minimize the great diversity there is and how people participate in a nation. So, as you said, within this concept of the Colombian nation, I think we're agreeing that there are many different ways of being Colombian, depending on gender. It could be race, it could be socioeconomic class, it could be location, sexual orientation. There are many, many different ways to identify and practice being Colombian. The question is which representations make it into our language teaching context. So I think that has been a real obsession of mine for the past 15 years, is always thinking critically about um, what kind of language, what kind of English. Well, if I'm telling, okay, to get to your question about the American context. So if I am telling students that I'm teaching them American English, so I have to define for myself what is American English anyway. Um, I know there's a problem with using that term in general. But what does it mean by North American United States English? So, and on one sense, I could try to teach the students all of the varieties of American English, which would be, of course, impossible. That's ridiculous. There's no way to do that. But generally, what happens in my experience is that teachers and curricula, program administrators, even students are seeking one defined category of American English. This is American English only. This is not, this is not, this is not, this is not, this is the only American English. So I think there should be some kind of midpoint between the two. Of course, we can't talk about every single language variety, but I think we're limiting students if we're only presenting them with just one sanitized, standardized version. Um, So I think what I can do in my classroom, and I would love to hear everyone's ideas in the group, but what I've tried to do is to increase representation and diversity of representation as much as possible. That's one thing I try to do. So where possible, I try to expand the curriculum. I expose students as much as possible to different varieties of American English, different ways that people use English in the United States. Um, I like to also use multilingual models. I think, I don't know about you, but in my area, it's a lot of monolingual models that the only good model for a language classroom is a monolingual native speaker. I try to use multilingual speakers as much as I can. I think those are really important, realistic models of the world. And the other thing I try to do is to be very transparent with students about my limitations. That whenever I talk about American culture or American identity, I'm really talking through my own subjective lens of what I've experienced. So I'm white, straight, I guess middle class. I've always, I haven't experienced financial insecurity. I come from the South originally, and then I was in the north. I've traveled a lot. So all of those things go into my understanding of America. So that's going to be limiting to my students. So I have to be very clear in my own subjectivity. And I think the last thing I do is to always contextualize my observations. So whenever we approach generalizations about a national culture or a national people, I always encourage my students and myself to contextualize it. So if you say, um, yeah, I traveled to Thailand and everyone in Thailand was so kind. So the Thai people are very kind people and very polite. All right, we've heard those kinds of statements before, and we've all made them. But what I try to do in the classroom is to let students know that I say this based on maybe 2 days I spent in Bangkok, maybe at a hotel, and maybe doing some tourist stuff, maybe at an academic conference. So it's very limited, this generalization that I'm giving to you. So I try to encourage students to always be sensitive and aware of the limitations of their generalizations. What else am I going to say? Yeah, I think those are the things that I do. Um, David, how about you? What are your thoughts on representation in the classroom?
Yes, thanks for your answer. Yes, I think at UPTC and at our program, we are really into like intersectionality because I think in Colombia, we are really different and we have like many challenges ahead. But yes, I do consider that we have we must have like an intercultural dialogue because I think that when we close like ourselves to our own perspective, maybe that leads to segregation in somehow. But yes, I
Mhm.
think it's interesting to talk about the topic. So thanks for your answer.
Thank you, David. I mean, one other thing too is about student expectations as well. So students come into the classroom expecting certain representations of a language, representations of a culture. So I think we as teachers have to help them think in more sophisticated ways and to think in more inclusive ways to recognize and to value the diversity that's there. So I saw this in my dissertation study. The students were expecting a certain kind of English from a certain kind of teacher. And it was important to be very distinct from Mexico, very distinct from Spanish language. That was very important to the students. In another study, I was working with students of Japanese and how they were creating a hypothetical project, and they were very sensitive to the types of representations that people expect about Japan. So it's not that we're going to represent the true, authentic Japan. We're going to represent this set of stereotypes that people will recognize and find familiar and reassuring. So David, thank you so much. Thank you for this conversation.
And Professor, we also have Juana Rodriguez. So Juana, if you want, the floor is all yours.
Yes, Juana.
Okay, hi, good evening and good morning. Like,
Hello. Good evening. Good morning.
okay, so I think everything gets like connected because I in the last three questions I had like research and reshaping my question because
Okay.
like everything gets connected. But I think like in here in Colombia we are in the field of English as a foreign language. So speaking about how English is always related with American culture and maybe, but not too much here in Colombia. We always like connect the English and the American culture. So as Colombians and trying to have this English as a lingua franca, how like how can we like appropriate English for us to learn it like a known language? Yeah, like leaving the stereotypes and leaving like all the perceptions of American English, but now Colombian English.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Anna, for the question and for your interest in this topic. And I'm so pleased to hear how this discussion is helping you to make new connections, important connections. So this is very valuable to you as an emerging scholar, and then also as you enter into the profession of language teaching. Yeah, so English as a lingua franca, to get to your question, is really interesting because of the challenge it poses for nationalism. So if we think about several generations ago, maybe in like the mid 1900s or so, up until that point, my experience, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like when it comes to language education, usually it was very clearly within the boundaries of nationalism. So if I study English, I'm going to only study American English. If I'm going to study a culture, it's only going to be this culture. So everything was defined very clearly by national cultures. But that's why I think English as a lingua franca and related fields are very important because they challenge these nationalized boundaries. And you are the experts on English lingua franca, but as my feeling is that English lingua franca is about um, taking agency and taking ownership of the linguistic practices and recasting them according to a different framework. So instead of the past, what I was suggesting that English belongs to maybe white, Western European people coming from only certain parts of the United States and only coming from maybe representing certain ethnic groups, maybe genders, socioeconomic classes. I think English lingua franca is doing away with that and then saying that we're going to take ownership of these linguistic practices and then really understand how they work as a universal practice, I guess, to bring us together as a form of communication, as a form of conducting our social lives, perhaps for specific functions in a universal global sense. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think English as a lingua franca is very important in that respect because it it gives us the arguments and it gives us the logic to disconnect the linguistic practice from the national category. So instead of saying we are studying the English language as it is spoken in the United States, we can separate that and say we are studying this linguistic code, which we're calling English, but we're also looking at it as a universal element, as a universal tool, and therefore it takes on different shapes according to the context. And the people who are expert users are the owners of this particular code, this linguistic variety. And that leads to legitimization and then recognition and celebration of uh, forms of English language practice that are already in use. But English lingua franca gives us the platform to elevate those linguistic practices and recognize them and provide them the legitimacy that that the users are entitled to. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, completely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
So
think there is like a lot of things that we have to take in account because sometimes we start learning English and sometimes we face the discrimination of one essential thing that is the pronunciation. So that is one of the a lot of things that have like things of this aspect of learning English. But one thing could be the pronunciation. So the only pronunciation correct is not American or British. That there could be like Colombian or Latin American. Like, yeah. Thank you so
mhm.
much for answering.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Anna. Thank you for your perspectives. And yeah, I agree. I think there's no reason why we can't kind of expand the curriculum, I guess, or the field of language education and understand English in much more diverse and sophisticated ways and think about different forms of pronunciation and what is appropriate for which particular context. There's no reason why we can't do it. We have all of the methodological tools now to do this, so we are ready. The next generation will do it. This is your generation. You will do it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Juana, for the question. Professor Ryan, thank you so much for having joined us in this space today. We really appreciate your company, your expertise, your knowledge regarding these topics, because we are pretty aware that you are, as I said at the beginning, a global scholar. So, Professor, thank you so much. We appreciate this session with you today, Professor.
Thank you, Professor John, for this invitation. This has been a really rewarding and exciting opportunity. I'm so happy to connect with everyone. Thank you, Professor John, for inviting me in and for your continued friendship and being just a great colleague. I hope from this conversation it has inspired in everyone the beginnings of a research agenda that you can enjoy over the course of your career. And I wish everyone good luck and great success in your career as a language teacher. Thank you for joining this profession. I'm biased, of course, but I think this is the best profession in the world, and I'm glad you've chosen it.
Yes, Professor. Thank you so much. And guys, thank you so much for having joined us here today too. So the idea is to continue with the conversation. So in a different point, we are going to retake these issues. And thanks again, once again, for having joined us today. So have a good time in the time being. And Professor, thank you so much again, as usual.
Thank you, John. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye. Have a good weekend.